Hey guys, welcome back to the only history class where the moaning is less about boredom and more about the existential horror of human intimacy. Tonight we're peeling back the gilded curtains on something truly special, royal honeymoons. Forget the soft focus, candlelight fantasy you've seen in Hollywood rom-coms. Those were lies, spun by people who never had to watch their future in-laws witness their first sweaty, fumbling attempt at procreation. If you've got a stomach for the grotesque and a perverse curiosity about how power warps the most intimate human act, you're in the right place. And while you're here, do me a favor and hit that like button. Let me know in the comments what twisted, historical tidbit shocks your fragile modern sensibilities the most. We're all perverts here, right? All right, let's rip the band-aid off. Picture this. It's medieval Europe, and a royal wedding has just concluded. You're a young queen, barely out of girlhood, wedded to some grizzled, gout-ridden king you've never met until yesterday. Sound romantic? It wasn't. Your wedding night isn't about whispered sweet nothings or tender embraces. Oh no, sweet summer child. It's a public performance, a bizarre, mandated spectacle designed to prove the marriage was, shall we say, consummated. Because if it wasn't, well, your new husband might just declare you barren or worse, accuse you of witchcraft, and send you packing back to your father in disgrace. The stakes were higher than your virginity. They were about dynastic survival. The whole affair stank of political necessity, a rancid perfume layered over the natural human smells of fear and desperation. This wasn't love. This was a duty, a transaction, and often a violation, all wrapped up in silk and brocade. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty, the details that make you want to scrub your skin raw. We're talking the lectio probatoria, or the proof of bed. After the feast, after the ale had flowed, and the boars had been carved, the royal couple would be led to their marriage bed. But they weren't alone. Oh, heavens no. Close family members, esteemed nobles, sometimes even bishops or other church dignitaries would accompany them. Imagine your aunt, your priest, and your future boss all standing around, watching you change into your nightclothes. It's enough to make your bowels clench tighter than a miser's purse. These esteemed onlookers weren't there for moral support. They were there as witnesses. They'd physically lead the couple to the bed, make sure they were actually in the bed, and then, after perhaps some brief, awkward moments of supposed privacy, they'd return. But wait, there's more. The next morning, or sometimes even moments later, they'd be back to inspect the sheets. Yes, the sheets. They were looking for blood, that telltale smear of crimson, the official stamp of virginity lost, the proof that the deed was done and the future lineage secured. Without it, whispers would start, doubts would fester, and your fragile position would crumble faster than a stale biscuit. It was a vile, humiliating public health inspection disguised as tradition. Consider the abject terror. This wasn't a private moment of discovery, however fumbled. This was an assignment, a test you couldn't fail, with the eyes of an entire court, and by extension, a nation, scrutinizing your performance. The pressure to bleed on cue, as it were, must have been suffocating. What if you didn't? What if the hymen wasn't obliging? Were you then a fraud, damned, barren before you even had a chance to try? The psychological toll alone could probably shatter a psyche. This ritual, designed to guarantee purity and fertility, paradoxically stripped away all dignity, leaving only raw, exposed vulnerability. It was less about intimacy and more about property transfer, a body subjected to state scrutiny. The bed itself became a stage, the couple mere actors in a grotesque play orchestrated by the demands of the crown. The air must have been thick with unspoken judgments, with the palpable tension of a biological clock ticking louder than any courtier's gossipy whispers. Let's dive further into the sheer absurdity. Sometimes the bedchamber wasn't just observed, it was actively blessed. Priests would come in, sprinkle holy water, offer prayers for fertility, all while the trembling couple awaited their forced coitus. Imagine the pious mumblings overlaying the nervous fumbling. It was a bizarre mashup of sacred ritual and carnal demand, and for the young, often terrified bride, this was her introduction to marriage, to power, to her new life, a life where her body was not her own, but a vessel for the continuation of a bloodline, a piece of political chess. Her pleasure was irrelevant, her desires non-existent. Her sole purpose was to conceive, to produce heirs, and to do so under the gaze of everyone who mattered. The whole scene was an unholy amalgamation of spiritual guidance and voyeuristic curiosity, a truly stomach-churning cocktail of expectations. And what about the groom? Was he exempt from the pressure? Not entirely, though certainly less so. His virility was also on display. An impotent king was a king whose line might die out, a king whose claim might be challenged. So while he wasn't being inspected for virginity, his performance was under silent, collective judgment. And let's be honest, who performs well under such circumstances? The stress alone could turn a stallion into a nervous pony. The whispered jokes, the knowing glances, the sheer anticipation in the room must have been a crushing weight. This wasn't a spontaneous act of passion. It was a mandatory, politically charged act of reproduction, stripped bare of all joy. The entire process reeked of ownership, of the body as a political tool, a mere means to an end, utterly devoid of genuine connection or human tenderness. It was cold, clinical, and calculating, despite all the pomp and circumstance. The sheer indignity of it, honestly. You're talking about powerful individuals, queens and kings, yet their most private moments were laid bare for public consumption. This wasn't some peasant hovel where space was scarce and privacy a luxury. This was a royal palace where gold leaf adorned every surface, yet personal boundaries were non-existent. The irony is stark. Immense wealth and power, yet absolutely no autonomy over your own body, your own sexuality. You were a walking incubator, a royal broodmare, expected to produce results on demand under the watchful, judgmental eyes of an entire court. And woe betide you if you failed to provide the necessary visual proof, that smear of blood that validated your existence and secured your position. That little red stain was your ticket to continued existence within the gilded cage of royalty. No wonder some of these unions produced offspring who were as emotionally stunted as they were politically significant. The very foundation of their family life was built on public humiliation and forced intimacy. It's enough to make you shiver. And the aftermath? Even after the sheets were inspected and the royal lineage presumably secured, the pressure didn't vanish. The queen was then expected to get pregnant, and quickly. Every month without a swelling belly was another month of whispers, another month of anxiety. The pressure to conceive was a constant, suffocating cloud, hanging over every subsequent act of intimacy. It wasn't about lovemaking, it was about baby-making, under the most stringent and public conditions. And if a son didn't appear within a reasonable time frame, well then the conversation shifted to divorce, to annulment, to the convenient discovery of some previously unmentioned impediment. The woman was always blamed. Her body was a battlefield, not a haven. Her womb, a public trust. And the initial deflowering, that awkward, watched moment, was just the opening salvo in a lifetime of bodily scrutiny and reproductive demands. It was a grim initiation into a world where private acts were always public currency. This wasn't just a quaint historical oddity, mind you. This was a system, a cruel, efficient mechanism designed to ensure continuity of power disguised as tradition. It stripped women of their agency, turned men into reluctant performers, and ensured that the initial act of intimacy in a royal marriage was less about connection and more about proving a point. The point being, of course, that the crown owned their bodies, their futures, and their reproductive capabilities. So the next time you see a movie where the royal couple shares a tender, private moment on their wedding night, remember the reality. The leering relatives, the expectant priests, the scrutinizing sheets, and the overwhelming pressure to perform for the sake of the dynasty. It's enough to make you swear off marriage entirely, isn't it? Just another charming slice of human history, where lust and power converged in the most uncomfortable ways imaginable. Let's really wallow in the filth of it all, shall we? Imagine the smells. Not just the usual human scents, mind you, but the lingering odor of too much stale wine, the rich, gamey scent of roasted meat clinging to clothes, the heavy perfume designed to mask the general reek of a pre-modern populace. And into this sensory miasma, you're expected to engage in the most intimate of acts. The air itself would have been thick with the cloying aroma of unwashed bodies, nervous sweat, and perhaps the faint, metallic tang of fear. It wasn't just a visual inspection, it was a full assault on the senses, demanding performance in an environment that was fundamentally repellent. The idea of courtly love must have been a truly bitter joke to anyone forced into such a matrimonial cage. This wasn't about wooing, it was about wrestling with biological necessity under the most unappetizing conditions. The sheer lack of privacy, the utter violation of personal space, it's almost beyond modern comprehension. For a woman particularly, this first act of marriage was less a union and more a ritualistic butchering of her personal autonomy. Her body became a public utility, her most intimate experience reduced to a checklist item. And the psychological scars, the profound sense of shame and exposure, would surely linger far longer than any physical discomfort. It's not just a historical curiosity, it's a chilling reminder of how power can dissect and control the most fundamental aspects of human existence, turning desire into a cold political calculation. The act of consummation was less about genuine connection and more about a grotesque, official stamp of approval, a bureaucratic necessity dressed in velvet and gold. Every throb, every moan, every shudder, if they even dared to manifest, was not for personal release but for public validation. A truly wretched start to any lifelong partnership, wouldn't you agree? It sets a rather bleak precedent for what love truly means when the entire kingdom is essentially in your bed, breathing down your neck, waiting for that damnable bloodstain. This wasn't a choice, it was an imposition. A woman, often a teenager, was thrust into this situation with zero preparation, zero agency, and absolute accountability for an outcome that was largely beyond her control. The concept of foreplay, of mutual desire, of even basic human comfort, was utterly foreign to this brutal, performative expectation. It was a crude, almost animalistic act, stripped of tenderness and imbued with the crushing weight of dynastic pressure. And for the king, perhaps older, perhaps burdened by his own insecurities, the pressure to perform for an audience, even a symbolic one, must have been equally debilitating. The whole affair was a masterclass in how to extract every last drop of dignity from a situation, leaving only the raw, exposed nerves of two individuals forced into an unholy alliance under the most public and unforgiving of lights. It's a testament to human resilience, or perhaps just sheer desperation, that any of these unions managed to produce anything resembling a functional family, let alone an heir. The seeds of discord and, frankly, disgust were sown on that very first horrifying wedding night. A perfect start, then, to a life of misery. Forget the marble statues of gods and goddesses frolicking in idealized, chaste meadows. Ancient Rome and Greece, those supposed cradles of civilization, were actually cesspools of perversion, power plays, and utterly bizarre sexual customs that would make your modern sensibilities curl up and weep. We're talking about societies obsessed with lineage, where women were little more than walking wombs, and men, well, they had their own set of equally repellent, albeit different, expectations. This wasn't about love or passion, it was about duty, about the relentless grind of procreation, often under the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable. The glory of antiquity had a particularly foul stench when you got close enough to sniff its underbelly. It's enough to make you question the entire concept of a golden age. In Roman society, particularly for the elite, marriage was a transaction, a way to forge alliances, consolidate wealth, and, most importantly, produce legitimate heirs. The concept of a honeymoon, as we understand it, a private, romantic getaway, was alien. Your wedding night was again less about intimacy and more about sealing the deal. The bride, often incredibly young, sometimes barely pubescent, was transferred from the potestas power of her father to that of her husband. Her virginity was a valuable commodity, a guarantee of legitimate offspring, and its proof was crucial. The Romans didn't have the same public sheet inspection rituals as the medieval Europeans, but the pressure for consummation was just as intense, if perhaps more subtly enforced. Your value as a woman hinged almost entirely on your ability to bear sons. If you failed, you were not just a disappointment, you were a failed investment, a broken vessel cast aside. The sheer weight of that expectation, the constant low throb of anxiety in every royal woman's life, must have been a living hell. Consider the Roman elite, those grand senators and emperors with their philosophical pretensions. Their private lives were often a grotesque pantomime of power and control. Take the concept of dignitas and gravitas, dignity and seriousness. These weren't just abstract ideals. They influenced everything, even the bedroom. For a powerful Roman, sex wasn't just about pleasure. It was about asserting dominance, about fulfilling a civic duty. And for their wives, it was about passive reception, about providing the necessary raw material for future citizens. There was no romance, no equality, just a stark power imbalance played out under silk sheets. The marital bed was not a place of refuge, but another arena where social order was reinforced, where the male dominated and the female submitted, not always willingly. The very air in those luxurious villas must have been thick with unspoken resentments and the heavy, cloying scent of forced compliance. And let's talk about the age disparity, which was often staggering. It was not uncommon for a powerful Roman man in his 30s, 40s, or even 50s to marry a girl of 12 or 13. Imagine this young, terrified girl suddenly thrust into the sophisticated, often debauched world of an older man. Her body barely formed, her mind still grappling with childhood, she was expected to transform overnight into a wife, a matron, a mother. Her first sexual encounter was not just with a stranger, but with a powerful, often intimidating, patriarch who viewed her as property. The act itself would have been terrifying, an experience of raw power imbalance and potentially pain. The shame, the confusion, the sheer violation of innocence, all swept under the rug of tradition and dynastic necessity. It's enough to make you retch. These weren't unions of affection, they were calculated risks for the continuation of a bloodline, and the personal cost was always borne by the most vulnerable party. Then there was the concept of the matrona. Once married, a Roman woman's identity shifted. She was no longer just a daughter, she was a wife, and soon, hopefully, a mother. Her reputation was paramount. Any hint of impropriety, any perceived infidelity, could ruin her and, by extension, her family. So, while her husband might engage in dalliances with slaves or prostitutes, a perfectly acceptable male pastime, mind you, she was expected to remain pure, chaste, and utterly devoted to him and the household. The double standard was not just glaring, it was baked into the very fabric of society. Her body was for legitimate procreation only, his for whatever carnal urges he desired to sate with whomever he pleased. This created a climate of constant fear and control for the women, where their very existence was polished by the male gaze. The marital bed then became a cage, beautifully adorned, but a cage nonetheless, restricting and suffocating, any genuine sense of self or desire. And let's not forget the bizarre rituals surrounding fertility. While not necessarily part of the wedding night itself, the pressure to conceive led to strange practices. Roman women would visit temples, make offerings, sometimes even wear specific amulets, or engage in unusual acts to appease the gods of fertility. Imagine the desperation, the public displays of supplication, all to achieve the one thing that defined your worth, a child. The shame of barrenness was profound, a mark of divine disfavor, a social death sentence. So, the honeymoon, if you can call it that, was just the beginning of a relentless, often humiliating journey towards conception. Every lunar cycle became a public referendum on your effectiveness as a wife, every delayed period a source of immense anxiety. The constant pressure to perform not just sexually but reproductively was a suffocating blanket that few managed to escape. Moving to ancient Greece, particularly Athens, the situation for women was arguably even more restrictive. Athenian women, especially those of good families, were kept in strict seclusion. Their world was the gynaexium, the women's quarters, rarely venturing out, and then only with chaperones. Marriage for an Athenian woman was primarily about providing legitimate heirs for her husband, ensuring the continuation of his oikos household. Again, love was irrelevant. The wedding ceremony itself was symbolic, involving rituals like bathing, sacrifice, and feasting. The culmination was the katechismata, where the bride was led to the groom's house, showered with nuts and figs, symbols of fertility, and then taken to the marital chamber. This was not a moment of tender intimacy, it was a ritualistic transfer of property. The Athenian wedding night itself, while less publicly scrutinized than medieval practices, was still fraught with the weight of expectation. The groom, often much older, would engage with his young bride, sometimes barely a child, with the sole purpose of procreation. Her role was passive, her experience likely painful and bewildering. Historians suggest that for many young Athenian brides, the wedding night was a traumatic event, a brutal awakening to the realities of their powerlessness. The very act of sex was stripped of any potential for pleasure and reduced to a functional duty, a means to an end. This was not about mutual desire, it was about the male fulfilling his civic duty to produce citizens, and the female fulfilling her biological duty to bear them. The air in those cloistered rooms must have been thick with silence and unspoken fear. And what about the concept of paiderastia? While not directly related to marriage, it highlights the male-centric nature of Greek society and sexuality. Adult men often sought intimate relationships with younger boys, seeing it as a form of mentorship and education. This was considered noble and intellectual, while sexual relations with women were often viewed as purely for procreation, a necessary but less elevated act. This deeply ingrained misogyny meant that the marital bed was often a place of duty rather than desire for the husband as well, who might seek his true affection and intellectual companionship elsewhere. This wasn't a partnership. It was an arrangement where the wife's primary function was to be a baby factory, and the husband's emotional and physical fulfillment lay outside the marital bond. It paints a rather bleak picture of intimate life in ancient Greece, doesn't it? The supposed birthplace of democracy also perfected the art of emotional repression in the bedroom. The Greek concept of pharmakon, meaning both remedy and poison, feels particularly apt when discussing these ancient honeymoons. Marriage was a remedy for social instability, a way to ensure continuity and order. But for the individuals trapped within its rigid confines, it was often a poison, corroding dignity, fostering resentment, and crushing personal desire. The women especially were mere instruments, their bodies owned, controlled, and valued only for their reproductive potential. Their silence, their endurance, became their only means of survival. This wasn't love, wasn't partnership, wasn't even genuine companionship. It was a cold, calculated transaction, executed under the weight of tradition and societal expectation, leaving behind a legacy of emotional barrenness, even if the physical womb was fruitful. It's a stark reminder that what some call civilization often rests on a foundation of profound personal subjugation. So the next time you marvel at the grandeur of the Roman Forum or the Parthenon, spare a thought for the human sacrifices made in the marital beds of those societies, the young girls, the constrained women, the men performing a duty rather than expressing desire. It wasn't a world of romantic sunsets and whispered secrets. It was a world of public duty, private pain, and the relentless, suffocating pressure of dynastic demands. A pretty grim start to any partnership when the very act of union is devoid of joy and imbued with such suffocating obligation. The very idea of a honeymoon for these people was a cruel joke, a brief, terrifying prelude to a lifetime of expected and often unfulfilling service. Forget the delicate cherry blossoms and serene tea ceremonies. The imperial courts of East Asia, particularly China and Japan, were cauldrons of simmering tension, ruthless power struggles, and sexual politics so convoluted they'd make your head spin. We're talking about vast harems, intricate hierarchies of concubines, and the omnipresent, unsettling shadow of the eunuch. A royal honeymoon in these empires wasn't just a brief, awkward encounter. It was an initiation into a labyrinth of surveillance, control, and constant, quiet terror. The emperor's bedchamber was less a haven of intimacy and more a battlefield where silent wars were waged for influence, and a woman's body was the primary weapon. The air in those lavish palaces was thick with intrigue, stifling any genuine human connection under layers of ritual and absolute power. Let's dissect the Chinese imperial harem, a beast of an institution. Imagine a single man, the son of heaven, the emperor, possessing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women. These weren't just concubines. There were empresses, consorts, imperial concubines of various ranks, ladies-in-waiting, and countless palace maids. The sheer logistics of managing such a vast human inventory alone are mind-boggling. A new emperor's honeymoon, or rather, his initial sexual experiences within the harem, involved a highly ritualized process designed to ensure not love, but proper lineage and political stability. There was no concept of a private, exclusive first night. Instead, it was an exercise in systematic procreation. The emperor's sexual life was a state affair, meticulously documented and managed. Your first night as a royal consort wasn't about fireworks, it was about ticking boxes on a dynastic ledger. The sheer scale of the harem created an environment of intense competition and profound loneliness. Women entered this system, often as young girls, plucked from their families and thrust into a gilded cage where their entire existence revolved around attracting the emperor's fleeting attention. His visits were not spontaneous acts of desire. They were often scheduled, dictated by astrological signs or decided by the empress herself based on a complex system of recommendations and political maneuvering. A concubine's value, her power, her very survival, depended on her ability to bear the emperor a son. Every night he spent elsewhere was a night of anxiety, a gnawing fear that her chance for status, for security, for progeny, was slipping away. The silence of those long, empty nights in the inner chambers must have been deafening, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the palace and the frantic beating of a desperate heart. And then there were the eunuchs. These castrated men, often from humble origins, rose to immense power within the imperial palace because they were considered safe. They couldn't start their own dynasties, couldn't impregnate the concubines. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, his personal servants, his guards, and, perhaps most disturbingly, his gatekeepers to intimacy. If a concubine was chosen for the emperor, it was a eunuch who often escorted her, naked or nearly so, wrapped in a blanket, to the imperial bedchamber, The sight of her, vulnerable and exposed, being carried past dozens of eunuchs must have been a profoundly dehumanizing experience. The act itself was observed, not directly, but through the ever-present knowledge that eunuchs were just outside, listening, waiting, clocking the time. Her body was not hers, it was state property, and the eunuchs were its meticulous, unblinking custodians. Every grunt, every sigh, every moment of supposed intimacy was under an invisible, yet suffocating, surveillance. The pressure to conceive a son was relentless, and the lack of privacy extended even to the most intimate details of a woman's body. If a concubine did manage to get pregnant, her diet, her movements, her every bodily function would be meticulously monitored. And should she give birth to a daughter, while not a disaster, it certainly didn't elevate her status as much as a son would. The constant, gnawing anxiety over progeny, coupled with the brutal competition among hundreds of other women, created a truly toxic environment. Many women withered, growing old in the palace, never once catching the emperor's eye, their lives consumed by an unfulfilled purpose. Their honeymoon, if it even happened, was a single, terrifying night, followed by decades of yearning and regret. The palace walls, for all their grandeur, were nothing but a gilded tomb for countless forgotten women. Moving to Japan while the harem system wasn't quite as vast as China's, the imperial court had its own peculiar set of sexual politics. Emperors and powerful nobles often had multiple consorts and concubines, though the emphasis on lineage and purity for the main empress was paramount. The imperial wedding, often highly ritualized and steeped in Shinto traditions, was less about personal affection and more about the unification of powerful families and the sacred continuation of the imperial line. For a young empress entering the court, her honeymoon was less a private event and more a public declaration of her new status as the primary vessel for future emperors. Her identity became inextricably linked to her fertility. Consider the intricacies of court life in Heian, Japan, as depicted in classics like The Tale of Genji. While fictionalized, it offers a glimpse into a world where alliances were forged through marriage and sexual relationships were deeply intertwined with political power. A nobleman's influence could rise or fall based on the women he married and the children they produced. For the women particularly, their value was tied to their beauty, their artistic accomplishments, and crucially, their ability to bear powerful sons. The emperor's consorts were constantly vying for his attention, not out of love, but out of a desperate need for security and influence. A night with the emperor was a victory, a potential step up in the brutally competitive hierarchy. Every whispered word, every gesture was fraught with hidden meaning, observed by 1,000 watchful eyes. The emotional landscape of these imperial honeymoons was one of profound loneliness and strategic calculation. Imagine being a young woman groomed your entire life for this singular purpose, to enter a palace, compete with dozens of others, and hope to bear a child for a man who barely knows your name. There was no space for genuine affection, for mutual desire, for the quiet intimacy of a new couple. Instead, there was the suffocating weight of expectation, the constant threat of being overlooked, and the terrifying realization that your entire future hinged on the whims of one powerful man and the machinations of countless jealous rivals. The palace, for all its beauty, was a gilded cage, and the marital bed a cold, hard throne of power. The very concept of privacy, as we understand it, was largely absent. From the moment a woman entered the imperial palace, her life was laid bare. Her movements, her conversations, even her internal state were subject to observation and interpretation. The honeymoon was just the first, most jarring experience of this pervasive surveillance. The expectation was not for personal happiness or fulfillment, but for the efficient production of heirs, ensuring the continuity of the dynasty. Any emotional cost was simply part of the price of power, paid overwhelmingly by the women who inhabited these ornate, yet utterly soul-crushing environments. The silence of those long, empty nights, the unspoken desires, the quiet despair. These were the true sounds of the imperial honeymoon, far more pervasive than any forced moans or feigned pleasure. So when you think of imperial grandeur, remember the countless women reduced to breeding stock, the eunuchs silently observing the crushing weight of dynastic expectation. These honeymoons weren't about love, they were about raw power, meticulously managed reproduction, and the systematic dehumanization of individuals for the sake of the crown. It's a bleak reminder that beauty and brutality often walk hand in hand in the annals of history, especially when it comes to the intimate lives of the powerful. The throb of empire was often powered by the silent, desperate pulse of 1,000 lonely hearts, a truly magnificent and utterly repulsive system. All right, let's drag ourselves out of the ancient world and into the early modern period of Europe, where silks got heavier, wigs got taller, and the political stakes of marriage somehow got even more excruciating. Forget the notion of love matches or personal compatibility. For royalty in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, marriage was a state-sponsored hostile takeover, a bloodless conquest executed through the bodies of its most vulnerable members. Your wedding vows weren't about "till death do us part," they were about "till diplomacy shifts or you fail to pop out a male heir." The royal honeymoon wasn't a romantic escape, it was a deeply uncomfortable, often physically repulsive, transaction, a cold-blooded affair of state where human desires were utterly crushed under the weight of dynastic necessity. The air in those gilded ballrooms smelled of ambition, fear, and barely concealed personal disgust. The sheer brutal reality of dynastic marriages meant you were often tied to someone utterly unsuited to you, sometimes physically repulsive, and occasionally deeply disturbing. Take the Habsburg jaw, for instance. Generations of obsessive inbreeding, designed to keep power and wealth within the family, resulted in a parade of genetic deformities. Prognathism so severe their mouths couldn't close, tongues too large for their oral cavities, and a general air of physical decrepitude. Imagine being a spirited, beautiful princess from a foreign court, full of youthful vigor, and being presented with your intended husband, a slack-jawed, drooling, possibly inarticulate product of generations of genetic bottlenecking. Your honeymoon, then, isn't about discovering each other, it's about overcoming your gag reflex, about forcing yourself into an embrace with someone who might literally struggle to articulate a single word, let alone a term of endearment. The physical revulsion alone would be enough to curdle your stomach. The medical examination of royal brides was a truly dehumanizing spectacle, a grim prelude to the so-called honeymoon. Before any marriage contract was signed, a princess might be subjected to a full physical inspection by a team of doctors, midwives, and often high-ranking noblewomen. They'd poke, prod, and examine her most intimate parts, all to ascertain her fertility and virginity. Hymenal integrity was paramount, of course, but so was the general assessment of her reproductive organs. Was she well formed for childbearing? Were there any physical defects that might impede conception? This wasn't a private doctor's visit. It was a state-mandated livestock inspection with the princess as the prize animal. The shame, the invasion, the utter lack of agency, it's enough to make you burn with indignation. Her body wasn't hers, it was a public resource, meticulously assessed for its productive capacity. And what if the groom was the problem? Early modern history is littered with accounts of kings and princes who were impotent, infertile, or simply disinclined to sexual relations, often due to illness, injury, or just plain lack of interest. For the royal bride, this presented a different kind of horror. Her entire purpose was to produce an heir, and if her husband couldn't or wouldn't perform, her life became a living hell of pressure, blame, and accusations. Consider Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Their marriage went unconsummated for years, a scandalous fact whispered throughout Europe. The pressure on poor Louis, who likely suffered from phimosis, a treatable condition, but certainly not then, must have been immense. The court gossiped, the doctors intervened, and the young couple was subjected to constant, humiliating scrutiny. Their honeymoon was a protracted period of frustration, public embarrassment, and an agonizingly slow reveal of the king's private failings. Every morning was a fresh wave of despair, every night a renewed, awkward failure. The very air they breathed in their private chambers was thick with unspoken tension and the suffocating weight of dynastic survival. The political stakes of a fruitful royal bed were astronomically high. Dynasties rose and fell on the ability of queens to produce male heirs. If a king failed to produce one with his first wife, he might seek an annulment or divorce, often on trumped-up charges of sorcery or barrenness, regardless of where the fault truly lay. The queen, stripped of her position, might be sent back home in disgrace, or worse, imprisoned or executed, as Anne Boleyn famously discovered. Her honeymoon was merely the first test in a brutal, lifelong examination where failure meant destruction. The pressure to get pregnant immediately was a suffocating blanket that never lifted. Every menstrual cycle was a fresh blow, every missed period a desperate, whispered hope. The sheer agony of waiting, of trying, of failing, all under the glare of public expectation, must have been a unique hell. Even when the union was physically viable, the act itself was often devoid of passion. These were strangers, united for political gain. The education of royal children often neglected anything approaching emotional intimacy or sexual comfort. Girls were taught to be submissive, boys to be dominant. The idea of mutual pleasure was laughable, a concept for poets and peasants, not for monarchs burdened with the weight of nations. The wedding night then became a duty, a mechanical act of procreation, sometimes performed with clinical efficiency, sometimes with palpable revulsion. The queen would simply lie there, endure, and pray for conception. The king would do his duty, perhaps thinking of his mistress or the next hunt. The emotional void in these unions was often vast, a gaping chasm filled only by duty and the silent throb of resentment. The hygiene of the era also added a layer of grotesque unpleasantness. Bathing was infrequent, scents were overpowering, and the lingering stench of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and various bodily functions was a constant companion. Imagine trying to engage in intimacy when both parties likely smelled like a combination of stale sweat, heavy perfume, and whatever delights their unemptied chamber pots emitted. It wasn't a world of fresh linens and rose petals, it was a world of cloying musk, lingering body odors, and the omnipresent threat of disease. The physical act was already a duty, layering it with such sensory assault would make it truly repellent. The opulent bedchambers, for all their gilt and velvet, must have often reeked of unwashed humanity and political desperation. And what of the emotional cost? The constant surveillance, the forced intimacy, the knowledge that your body was a tool of state, not your own. It bred resentment, coldness, and often deep-seated emotional scarring. Royal consorts might develop elaborate coping mechanisms, retreat into piety, or engage in quiet defiance through secret dalliances if they dared. But the fundamental truth remained. Their marital bed was a cage, and their honeymoon was the moment the door clanged shut. It was a bleak initiation into a life where personal desire was a luxury they could ill afford, and physical affection was merely a means to a dynastic end. The joy of a wedding was quickly eclipsed by the harsh realities of a politically mandated coupling, where every touch was a negotiation and every child a calculation. The cold, hard truth of royalty was often found in the desolate silence of their lonely, shared beds. The political maneuvers around royal impotence or perceived barrenness were truly Machiavellian. A king might publicly declare his wife barren even if the fault lay with him, to secure a divorce and find a new, hopefully more fertile queen. Or more subtly, a queen might be accused of infidelity if she produced no heir, or if her children lacked the physical characteristics of the royal line. The body, especially the female body, became a battleground for political legitimacy. The honeymoon, then, was not just a sexual act. It was a forensic examination, a public declaration of reproductive fitness, with disastrous consequences for those deemed inadequate. It was a truly dehumanizing start to any marriage, built on suspicion and biological uncertainty rather than trust or affection. The throb of anxiety in those first nights must have been deafening, drowning out any hope for genuine connection. So, next time you idealize the glamour of early modern European courts, remember the raw, often brutal, realities of their marital beds. The deformed spouses, the humiliating inspections, the crushing pressure to conceive, and the pervasive lack of personal autonomy. These honeymoons were less about love and more about dynastic survival, executed with a grim determination that stripped away all human tenderness. They were a testament to how far power would go to perpetuate itself, even if it meant sacrificing the dignity and often the happiness of its own pawns. A truly bleak testament to the perversions of power and lineage, wouldn't you agree? It makes your own awkward first dates seem positively charming by comparison. All right, if you thought we'd plumbed the depths of human discomfort, prepare yourselves, because we're about to dive into the truly disturbing aspects of royal honeymoons. We're going beyond mere awkwardness and into the realm of outright horror, where physical deformity, mental instability, and raw, unchecked power converged in the marital bed, creating nightmares that would make your skin crawl. This isn't just about societal pressure. This is about the profound, often tragic, consequences when human beings are treated as nothing more than political pawns, their bodies and minds sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. The air in these historical bedchambers was often thick with a sense of dread, of unspoken abuse, and the chilling silence of lives utterly crushed. Let's talk about physical deformities and disabilities, often concealed or downplayed, until the unfortunate spouse was literally brought to the marital bed. Imagine being a young, vibrant noblewoman sailing across oceans, full of naive hope for your future, only to be presented with a groom who is severely hunchbacked, crippled, or suffering from a disfiguring disease like smallpox, which often left survivors pockmarked and scarred. Or perhaps he was epileptic, with seizures that could strike at any moment. Your honeymoon then becomes not just an act of duty, but an act of profound revulsion, a forced intimacy with a body that might inspire pity, but certainly not desire. The psychological toll of being bound for life to a partner whose physical appearance or health deeply repels you, yet whom you are forced to share a bed with, is immense. It's a daily, silent scream, a constant battle against your own instincts, all for the sake of political stability. The power dynamics here are grotesque. One party is compelled to endure, the other, perhaps equally miserable, is inflicted upon. And what about mental illness? History is replete with examples of royal figures suffering from various forms of madness, from melancholia to full-blown psychosis. Imagine a wedding night where your spouse is not just physically unappealing, but mentally unstable, prone to violent outbursts, erratic behavior, or terrifying delusions. How do you consummate a marriage with someone who might believe they are a wolf, or the second coming of Christ, or simply utterly detached from reality? This isn't just an awkward encounter, it's a terrifying ordeal. The queen or king, trapped in this union, had no recourse. Divorce was often impossible, particularly if the mentally ill spouse was the monarch. Her life would become a constant tightrope walk, managing a volatile partner, fearing for her safety, all while maintaining the pretense of a normal, functioning marriage. The honeymoon was simply the first, most shocking glimpse into a lifetime of potential terror and profound loneliness. The very air must have throbbed with unacknowledged fear and desperation. Consider the case of Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad. While her madness is debated by historians, her marriage to Philip the Handsome was passionate, but also deeply troubled by his infidelities and her obsessive jealousy. After his sudden death, her grief allegedly spiraled into a macabre obsession with his corpse, which she carried with her for years, only opening his coffin to kiss his feet. While her honeymoon was initially passionate, her story highlights the fragility of royal mental health and the devastating consequences for their partners and the realm. Imagine being her lady-in-waiting or a distant relative observing this grotesque display. The very idea of intimacy with such a person becomes a morbid fascination, a terrifying descent into the macabre. The legacy of their honeymoon was one of morbid, decaying obsession, far removed from any semblance of romantic love. Then there's the outright cruelty and abuse. Not all royal spouses were kind, gentle, or even moderately considerate. Some were infamous for their brutality, their sadism, or their utter disregard for their partner's feelings. Imagine a wedding night where the physical act is not just a duty, but a painful, humiliating assault, where the groom, empowered by his absolute authority, treats his new wife not as a partner, but as a sexual object to be dominated and exploited. There are whispers, historical accounts of queens suffering severe physical abuse at the hands of their royal husbands, sometimes on the very first night, sometimes throughout their marriage. This wasn't just awkwardness, this was trauma etched onto the body and soul. The silence of the historical record often covers up these horrors, but the grim reality was undoubtedly far more prevalent than we might care to admit. The gilded cages of royalty often concealed the most brutal forms of private torment. The public humiliation aspects of some royal honeymoons were equally devastating. We've talked about the proof of bed rituals, but imagine the added layer of humiliation if the king failed to perform. Not only was the bride exposed, but the groom was, too, his virility publicly questioned. This could lead to desperate measures, the use of artificial phalluses to stimulate the queen, or even the bizarre practice of bringing in coadjutors, a kind of stand-in, a proxy, to ensure the consummation, particularly if the groom was too young, too old, or too impotent. The queen would endure this proxy, knowing her husband was likely observing, all to ensure a legitimate heir. It's a mind-bending level of degradation, turning the most private act into a performance for a desperate, power-hungry audience. The very thought makes your stomach churn with disgust. It was a carnival of shame, all for the sake of the crown. And let's not forget the constant threat of poisoning or assassination within the royal bedchamber. While not directly a part of the honeymoon act, the political landscape meant that any new spouse, especially one from a rival nation, could be viewed with deep suspicion. Imagine going to bed with someone who might genuinely want you dead, or who might themselves be poisoned by their enemies. The trust, the vulnerability inherent in intimacy was utterly absent, replaced by a chilling paranoia. Every kiss, every touch could be a prelude to betrayal or death. The honeymoon then becomes not just a marital initiation, but a perilous dance with fate where your very survival hangs in the balance. The sheets might be silk, but the air was thick with the stench of fear and the metallic tang of potential murder. The psychological warfare that often played out in these royal marriages could be as destructive as any physical abuse. The coldness, the indifference, the calculated cruelty of being used as a mere political tool. Imagine a lifetime with someone who views you purely as a means to an end, who withholds affection, denies you personal freedom, and constantly reminds you of your inferior status. The honeymoon was just the opening act in a lifetime of emotional barrenness, where genuine human connection was starved and replaced by an endless cycle of obligation and resentment. The silence of those vast, opulent rooms would throb with unspoken miseries, a chilling testament to the price of power. These royal unions, especially the ones shrouded in such dark circumstances, were not about happy beginnings. They were about grim calculations, about the perpetuation of power at any human cost. The individuals involved, regardless of their royal status, were reduced to cogs in a vast, uncaring machine. Their bodies were instruments, their minds often broken by the relentless pressure, and their private lives a public spectacle of degradation and despair. The most awkward royal honeymoons pale in comparison to those that were truly horrifying, leaving indelible scars on the participants and staining the pages of history with their bleakness. It's a stark reminder that beneath the glittering veneer of royalty, there often lay a swamp of human misery and institutionalized cruelty. A truly comforting thought, isn't it? All right, if the last few segments haven't completely annihilated your romantic notions of history, let's pivot to something truly delightful. The glorious state of royal hygiene, or rather, the profound and utterly repellent lack thereof. Forget scented candles and rosewater baths. We're talking about centuries where soap was a luxury, regular bathing a rarity, and the lingering scent of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and various human excretions was simply the background radiation of everyday life. Now imagine this delightful aromatic backdrop for the most intimate moment of your life, the royal honeymoon. The very thought makes your nose twitch, doesn't it? The historical reality was far grimmer and far smellier than any costume drama dares to portray. Let's be blunt, people stank. For centuries, across most of Europe, regular, full-body bathing was not a common practice, even among the wealthy. Water was difficult to heat and transport, and there was a pervasive, albeit misguided, belief that hot water opened the pores and made one more susceptible to disease. So instead of washing, people layered on perfumes and powdered their wigs and faces. The effect, as you can imagine, was less fresh linen and more a cloying, suffocating miasma of floral scents, trying desperately to mask the underlying funk of days, if not weeks, of accumulated sweat, grime, and bodily fluids. Imagine walking into a royal bedchamber meant for intimacy, only to be hit with a wall of competing, rancid odors. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was a sensory assault that would strip any semblance of romance from the air. Consider the royal couple on their wedding night. They've spent the entire day in heavy, elaborate clothing, sweating under the glare of hundreds of candles, indulging in rich, often gamey food, and copious amounts of wine. Their bodies, accustomed to infrequent washing, would be producing their own unique bouquet of human odors. Now strip those layers away. What's left? A potent combination of stale sweat, unwashed hair, and the faint, unsettling tang of lingering excretions. This wasn't a quick shower and a spritz of cologne. This was a plunge into the deep end of natural human musk. The very air they breathed must have been heavy, thick with the unadulterated smell of two unbathed bodies trying to become one. It puts a rather grotesque spin on the idea of getting closer, doesn't it? Every throb, every movement would release a fresh wave of reality. And let's not even get started on dental hygiene, or the lack thereof. Tooth decay was rampant, bad breath a universal companion. Imagine leaning in for a kiss, a supposedly tender moment, only to be assaulted by the putrid stench of rotting teeth and unbrushed gums. It's enough to make you recoil to choke back your own stomach contents. And this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a constant, pervasive barrier to intimacy, turning what should be a moment of connection into a test of endurance against your own gag reflex. The idea of truly passionate, open-mouthed kissing was likely an alien concept, reserved for literature, not for the pungent reality of a royal mouth. No wonder some couples resorted to simply getting the deed done as quickly and efficiently as possible. Then there were the chamber pots. Oh, the glorious, fragrant chamber pots. These were often kept right in the bedchamber, sometimes even under the bed. Imagine the subtle yet persistent aroma of human waste mingling with the aforementioned body odors and perfumes. A truly exquisite ambiance for a wedding night, wouldn't you agree? And what about the calls of nature during the act itself, or the lingering dampness? The practical realities of bodily functions in a world without modern plumbing add a layer of repulsive detail that costume dramas blissfully ignore. The royal bedchamber was not always a pristine sanctuary. It was often a functional space serving all bodily needs with the accompanying unavoidable smells. It makes you wonder how anyone managed to summon any degree of desire, let alone sustained passion, amidst such a pervasive assault on the olfactory senses. The clothing itself was often heavy, made of wool or silk, designed for warmth and display, not for breathability or cleanliness. These garments absorbed sweat and oils, retaining a cumulative scent over days of wear. Even when fresh clothes were donned, they often simply covered a body that hadn't seen water in days. The very act of undressing for the first time in front of your new spouse would be a revelation, not of beauty, but of basic biological reality. And that reality was often not pleasant. The lingering smell of old sweat, the faint aroma of urine or fecal matter clinging to undergarments, the general rankness that permeated even the finest fabrics, it was all part of the package. The royal bed was less a place of romantic surrender and more a functional space for a biological imperative, a space permeated by the unavoidable stench of unwashed humanity. And let's not ignore the pests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were ubiquitous, even in royal palaces. Imagine trying to engage in intimacy while being constantly bitten, or feeling the frantic crawl of tiny insects across your skin. The itching, the discomfort, the sheer unromantic reality of sharing your bed not just with your new spouse, but with an army of microscopic freeloaders would certainly put a damper on any passionate inclinations. The royal honeymoon, far from being a dream, could quickly devolve into a scratching contest, a frantic battle against unseen adversaries, further eroding any shred of dignity or romance. It's a rather humbling thought, isn't it? That even the most powerful monarchs were not immune to the primal annoyances of biting insects. The very concept of what constituted cleanliness was vastly different. A quick splash of water on the face and hands, a rub down with a scented cloth, or a change of outer garments might have been considered sufficient. The idea of a daily, thorough washing was simply not part of the cultural zeitgeist. So, for many royal couples, their honeymoon was a full sensory immersion into each other's natural, unfiltered body odors, a reality that the romantic painters of the era wisely chose to omit. It certainly adds a layer of practical discomfort to the already immense psychological and political pressures they faced. The royal marriage bed, rather than being a sanctuary of passion, was often a crucible of olfactory challenge, a testament to endurance over desire. So when you picture those grand historical weddings shimmering with gold and velvet, remember the hidden, pervasive reality of the smells, the unwashed bodies, the stale breath, the close quarters living with minimal sanitation. It adds a rather pungent layer to the political machinations and emotional traumas. The honeymoon, far from being a delicate dance of discovery, was often a robust confrontation with raw human physicality, stripped of its modern pleasantries. It's enough to make you appreciate modern plumbing and daily showers with a newfound fervor, isn't it? Because truly, historical intimacy was often less about romance and more about how much stench you could reasonably tolerate before fainting. A truly comforting thought for your next historical reenactment. All right, if the stench of history hasn't made you gag, let's talk about another delightful aspect of royal honeymoons: the absolute, soul-crushing lack of actual sexual education or preparation. Forget awkward sex ed classes or whispered conversations with friends. For royal children, particularly princesses, their entire lives were spent in cloistered environments, shielded from anything remotely carnal, only to be thrust, unprepared, into a politically vital, physically demanding, and often utterly bewildering intimate encounter. The ignorance is bliss approach to royal upbringing was, in the bedroom, a recipe for abject horror, a stark contrast between lofty societal expectations and brutal personal experience. The air in those lavish nurseries was clean of vulgarity, only to be replaced by the stale, suffocating air of naive terror on the wedding night. Imagine a young princess, perhaps 14 or 15, raised in a strict court, tutored in languages, history, music, and embroidery, but utterly devoid of any practical knowledge about her own body, let alone the male anatomy or the act of sex itself. Her education focused solely on her role as a future queen, how to conduct herself, how to manage a household, how to bear and raise heirs. The how of that last part, however, was conveniently omitted. It was assumed to be natural, an instinct that would magically appear. This deliberate ignorance, carefully cultivated by governesses and chaperones, meant that her wedding night was not just a first sexual experience, it was a traumatic awakening, a rude, brutal shock to a carefully constructed worldview. She might literally have no idea what was about to happen, beyond vague, ominous whispers. The terror of the unknown, combined with the weight of expectation, must have been paralyzing. And what about the groom? While princes might have had more exposure to the wider world, including concubines or mistresses, their education in sex was often equally perverse. It wasn't about mutual pleasure or tenderness. It was about dominance, about performance, about doing the deed to produce heirs. Their interactions with women were often transactional, reducing intimacy to a crude conquest rather than a shared experience. So, you have two individuals, both fundamentally unequipped for genuine intimacy, one utterly naive, the other perhaps crudely experienced, but devoid of tenderness. Their honeymoon then becomes a fumbling, awkward, and often painful collision of ignorance and inadequate preparation, rather than a discovery of shared passion. The whole affair reeked of duty, not desire. The silence surrounding sexual matters was deafening. There were no frank discussions, no compassionate explanations. Instead, there were euphemisms, veiled allusions, and the pervasive societal pressure to simply get on with it. A young bride might have heard hushed warnings from older women, vague references to doing her duty or bearing the inevitable, but nothing concrete, nothing empowering. This lack of information fueled fear and anxiety, transforming a potentially beautiful act into a terrifying ordeal. Her body, her burgeoning sexuality, became a source of shame and dread rather than a natural part of her being. The constant throb of unanswered questions, combined with an overwhelming sense of impending doom, must have made the journey to the marital bed feel like a march to the gallows. Consider the role of the midwives or matrons in some courts. While their explicit role was to assist in childbirth, their presence around the royal bedchamber, even if only indirectly, perpetuated the idea that the royal body and its reproductive functions were public property. They might offer vague advice or simply enforce rituals, but rarely did they provide genuine, compassionate instruction. Their presence merely emphasized the lack of privacy, the clinical nature of the act. The instruction was often limited to a simple directive: produce an heir. The mechanics, the emotions, the personal experience, these were utterly irrelevant. The whole setup was designed to strip away any personal agency, leaving only the grim duty. The double standards in sexual education were also glaring. While a princess was kept innocent, her future husband, the prince, might have been given access to prostitutes or concubines to gain experience. But even this experience was often divorced from genuine intimacy. It was about performance, about satisfying a biological urge, about asserting male dominance. He learned nothing about consent or mutual respect or the nuances of female pleasure. So when he finally encountered his virginal bride, he was often just as unequipped for true partnership, albeit for different reasons. Their honeymoon was a clash of learned gender roles, a dance of duty rather than desire, resulting in a profoundly unfulfilling, often traumatizing, initial encounter for both parties. The silence in the room was often not from awe, but from pure, unadulterated awkwardness and lack of communication. The psychological impact of this enforced ignorance cannot be overstated. For a young woman, her first sexual experience, meant to be a foundational moment of her marriage, was often reduced to a bewildering, painful, and humiliating encounter. This could lead to lifelong aversion to intimacy, to frigidity, or to a deep-seated resentment towards her husband. The emotional baggage from such a beginning could poison an entire marriage, turning it into a joyless procreation factory rather than a partnership. The quiet cries, the stiff bodies, the emotional distance that settled in after that first traumatic night. These were the true, unspoken legacies of royal sexual education. And let's not forget the immediate pressure to conceive. The lack of knowledge compounded the anxiety. How do you get pregnant if you don't even understand the mechanics? The fear of failing, of being deemed barren, was always looming. So the act itself became a desperate scramble for conception, devoid of pleasure, filled with tension. Every failed month was a public judgment, a mark against her ability to fulfill her royal duty. Honeymoon, therefore, was less a celebration of union and more a high-stakes fertility test, where the participants were woefully unprepared for the examination. It's enough to make you want to send a historical gyno to every single one of them, just to alleviate some of the confusion and pain. The sad irony is that for all the wealth and privilege, royal children were often denied the basic human experience of understanding their own bodies and sexualities. Their lives were meticulously curated for the purpose of dynastic succession, stripping away all personal autonomy, even over their own physical experiences. Their honeymoons were, therefore, the brutal culmination of this denial, a forced confrontation with a reality they were utterly unprepared for, resulting in a profound sense of violation and disappointment. The luxurious settings and ceremonial pomp could not mask the stark, painful truth. These were often children, forced into a crude performance of adulthood without any of the necessary tools or understanding. The throb of anxiety was a constant companion, echoing in the opulent silence. So when you consider the lives of historical royals, remember that beneath the crowns and jewels, they were often deeply ignorant, deeply vulnerable human beings, forced into intimate acts without preparation or consent. Their honeymoons were not romantic idyls, but often terrifying rites of passage, devoid of pleasure and laden with pressure. It's a stark reminder that even immense power doesn't guarantee a happy or informed private life. In fact, it often guarantees the opposite, a life stripped bare of personal agency, where every intimate act is a public performance and every pleasure is tainted by duty. A truly grim lesson in the cost of royal bloodlines. All right, if you thought the state-mandated procreation and the pervasive stench of historical hygiene were bad, let's inject a potent dose of religious zealotry into the royal honeymoon equation. Because nothing quite complicates the delicate dance of intimacy like a watchful, judgmental God, his earthly representatives, and a boatload of bizarre purity rituals designed to ensure your soul is as clean as your unwashed body. Religion wasn't just a comfort, it was another suffocating layer of control, turning the marriage bed into a spiritual battlefield where sins were meticulously catalogued and purity was policed with an iron fist. The air in these royal chambers was often thick, not just with human odors, but with the cloying incense of desperate prayer and the chilling whispers of divine judgment. For centuries, especially in Christian Europe, the Church held immense sway over secular life and absolutely zero aspect of human existence, particularly sex and marriage, escaped its watchful gaze. The primary purpose of marriage, according to the Church, was procreation. Any hint of pleasure for pleasure's sake was often condemned as lustful and sinful. So, for royal couples, their wedding night wasn't just about producing an heir for the state, it was about doing God's work, performing a sacred duty, often under the direct supervision or blessing of a priest. Imagine trying to get your freak on while knowing that a pious man of God has just blessed the sheets, probably muttered prayers over your very loins, and is now hovering just outside the door, metaphorically, or sometimes literally, clutching his rosary and tallying your sins. It's enough to make you spontaneously confess to everything. The blessing of the marriage bed was a common ritual. Priests would enter the bedchamber, sprinkle holy water, and offer prayers for fertility and purity. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a physical intrusion, a clear statement that even this most private space was subject to divine authority. The bed meant for intimacy was consecrated, made holy, and therefore bound by strict religious doctrines. Any deviations from approved sexual practices, anything considered unnatural or lustful, would be deemed a mortal sin, risking damnation. The pressure to perform correctly, not just for the state but for the eternal soul, must have been immense. Every throb, every breath was under the omnipresent, judging eye of God. And then there were the purity rituals surrounding the bride. Her virginity was not just a political asset, it was a religious virtue, a symbol of her innocence and suitability. The lectio probatoria. We discussed earlier the public inspection of the sheets for blood was often framed not just as dynastic proof, but as proof of God's blessing on her purity. If she didn't bleed, the whispers of witchcraft or sin might not just come from the court, but from the pulpit. She could be accused of having already known a man, an unforgivable sin that could lead to annulment, disgrace, and eternal damnation. Her bodily functions, or lack thereof, became a direct reflection of her spiritual standing. It was a brutal, physically intrusive theological examination, leaving her utterly exposed and vulnerable. Confession, too, played an insidious role. Many devout royals would confess their sexual sins, even the perceived ones, to their confessors. Imagine confessing the intimate details of your struggles on the wedding night, your lack of desire, your physical discomfort, your failure to conceive, to a celibate priest. Their advice, often steeped in rigid dogma rather than human understanding, would only add to the pressure and guilt. The marital bed became a place of spiritual reckoning, where every act was weighed against divine law, fostering shame and anxiety rather than connection. The very air in those confessionals must have been thick with the cloying stench of guilt and unfulfilled desire. The Church's influence extended to the very legitimacy of the marriage itself. If a marriage wasn't properly consummated, a physically defined act, it could be annulled on religious grounds, often at the king's behest. This gave the Church immense power, allowing it to intervene in royal bedrooms and effectively control dynastic succession. The notorious case of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, where Henry sought an annulment based on Catherine's previous marriage to his deceased brother and the biblical prescription against marrying one's brother's wife, perfectly illustrates this. The entire fate of a kingdom and the lives of its queens could hinge on the precise definition of consummation and the subjective judgment of religious authorities. The marital bed, far from being a private space, was a legal battleground with divine judgment as its ultimate arbiter. And what about the constant pressure to have legitimate children? The Church viewed children born outside of marriage as illegitimate, a stain on both the parents and the child. This religious dogma put immense pressure on royal couples to ensure every act of intimacy led to legitimate offspring, preferably sons. The honeymoon was thus infused with a sacred obligation, a divine mandate to procreate according to God's law. Any failure to do so, whether due to impotence, barrenness, or just plain bad luck, could be interpreted as divine disfavor, leading to intense spiritual and emotional distress. The guilt, the shame, the desperation to please both God and King must have been a suffocating weight, turning intimacy into a terrifying religious duty rather than a joyful union. The throb of anxiety in those moments was not just biological, but existential. The very concept of pleasure was often suspect. The Church, particularly in earlier centuries, emphasized the procreative aspect of sex above all else. Any enjoyment, any deviation from the simple purpose of reproduction was deemed sinful. Imagine a couple already under immense political pressure, now burdened by the theological weight of their actions. Every flicker of desire, every moan of pleasure could be a moment of sin. This created a profound disconnect between the natural human experience of intimacy and the rigid spiritual expectations, fostering shame and guilt where there should have been connection. The marital bed became a crucible for testing one's piety, rather than a space for mutual discovery and affection. So when you think about royal honeymoons, don't just remember the public scrutiny and the lack of hygiene. Add in the pervasive, suffocating presence of religious dogma dictating every aspect of their most private lives. The bizarre blessings, the fear of sin, the constant pressure to conform to divine and royal will. It transformed intimacy into a burdensome duty, stripped of joy and laden with anxiety. It's a stark reminder that power, whether secular or religious, has a long and ignoble history of invading the most sacred personal spaces, turning human desire into a controlled, scrutinized act of obligation. A truly divine start to a miserable life, wouldn't you agree? It makes your own religious relatives seem positively chill. All right, let's leave the relatively quaint miseries of European royal beds and plunge headfirst into the opulent, yet profoundly soul-crushing world of imperial harems. We touched on East Asia, but now let's cast our cynical gaze further to the Ottoman, Persian, and Indian empires, where the sheer scale of the ruler's sexual domain reached truly staggering, almost unfathomable proportions. Forget a single royal bedchamber. We're talking about sprawling complexes, veritable cities within cities, housing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women. A honeymoon in this context wasn't just an awkward night. It was a lottery ticket in a game of chance against 1,000 rivals, a desperate bid for survival and influence in a gilded cage of profound loneliness. The air in these harems, despite their lavishness, was thick with unspoken longing, brutal competition, and the constant, chilling fear of irrelevance. Consider the Ottoman harem, specifically the imperial harem of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. This wasn't just a place where the Sultan kept his concubines. It was a complex institution, a hidden world of power, intrigue, and rigid hierarchy. The women within it, from the lowest slave girl to the powerful Valida Sultan's mother, were all part of a vast, intricate system designed to produce male heirs and serve the needs of the Sultan and his dynasty. A new concubine entering the harem, often a young girl captured in war or purchased as a slave, had no concept of a honeymoon as a romantic initiation. Her first intimacy would be a terrifying, impersonal encounter, one small part of a larger, carefully managed reproductive process. Her body was merely a potential vessel for the next generation of Ottoman rulers. The process of selection was ruthless. The Sultan might select a concubine from a lineup of hundreds, or perhaps be presented with a promising new arrival. There was no courtship, no pretense of mutual desire. The chosen woman would be prepared, bathed, perfumed, and then, often with eunuchs overseeing the process, she would be presented to the Sultan. The encounter itself was a performative act, often brief, designed purely for the potential of conception. Her future, her survival, depended entirely on her ability to capture the Sultan's fleeting attention and, more importantly, to bear him a son. Every throb, every suppressed moan was a desperate prayer for pregnancy. The silence after the Sultan departed must have been deafening, filled only with the frantic beating of her own heart and the knowledge that hundreds of rivals awaited their own chance. The competition within the harem was brutal and relentless. With so many women vying for the Sultan's attention, life was a constant struggle for favor. Mothers of sons gained immense power and prestige, while childless women often withered into obscurity, spending their lives in luxurious but ultimately meaningless confinement. The older they got, the less likely they were to be noticed, their hopes for influence and security fading with each passing year. The honeymoon was a brief, terrifying opportunity, but it was just the first hurdle in a lifelong race for survival. Poison, intrigue, and alliances were common tools in this silent war, all aimed at securing a place closer to the Sultan's ear, or to ensure that one's own son ascended to power. The air was thick with barely concealed jealousy and the heavy scent of unfulfilled ambition. And the loneliness. Imagine being one woman among hundreds, all living under the same roof, all ostensibly married to the same man, yet never truly knowing him or experiencing genuine connection. Their lives were meticulously controlled, their movements restricted, their social interactions limited. The Sultan was a distant, often intimidating figure, a godlike presence whose occasional visits dictated their entire existence. The psychological toll of such a life, constant competition, profound isolation, and the relentless pressure to perform reproductively must have been immense. Many women likely suffered from deep depression, their lives a gilded cage of unfulfilled longing and quiet despair. The vastness of the harem was a monument to power, but also a sprawling testament to human isolation. In the Mughal Empire of India, the royal harems, or zenana, were equally vast and complex. Emperors like Akbar and Shah Jahan commanded enormous households of wives, concubines, dancers, and servants. The purpose was similar: to project power, forge alliances, and ensure a continuous supply of legitimate heirs. For a young woman entering such a zenana, perhaps as a diplomatic bride from a Rajput kingdom, or a new addition to the concubine ranks, her honeymoon would have been an overwhelming experience. She was plunged into a world of incredible luxury, but also rigid protocol and intense competition. Her worth was entirely dependent on her ability to produce a son and through him increase her own influence and the stability of her family. The emotional landscape of these imperial honeymoons was always one of profound power imbalance. The emperor, often a seasoned man, would take a young, terrified bride or concubine with absolute authority. Her pleasure was irrelevant, her compliance and fertility were all that mattered. The act was a duty, a means to an end, performed under the watchful eyes of palace staff, often female attendants or eunuchs, who ensured propriety and documented the proceedings. The initial encounter was stripped of any romance, reduced to a functional transaction. The throb of anxiety in these moments was not for personal connection, but for dynastic survival. The sumptuous silks and jewels could not hide the cold, calculating nature of these intimate acts. The silence of these women in the historical record is perhaps the most chilling aspect. They had no voice, no agency, their personal experiences often subsumed by the grand narratives of empire. Their honeymoons and subsequent lives were lived out in luxurious anonymity, their joys and sorrows largely unrecorded, overshadowed by the insatiable demands of their powerful husbands. Their bodies were utilized, their potential for pleasure ignored, and their emotional lives often sacrificed on the altar of imperial power. The overwhelming emphasis on progeny meant that every intimate act was a means to an end, a relentless pursuit of a son who would carry on the dynastic name. So when you gaze at the magnificence of the Taj Mahal, Or imagine the splendor of the Topkapi Palace. Remember the thousands of women who lived and died within those walls, their lives often defined by a single, terrifying honeymoon that might have lasted a few fleeting moments, followed by decades of yearning, competition, and often profound loneliness. These imperial harems were not places of romantic dalliance. They were highly efficient, dehumanizing reproductive factories where individual desires were utterly crushed under the weight of an empire's insatiable need for heirs. It's a stark, grim reminder that absolute power often manifests in the most brutal and intimate ways, turning human beings into pawns in a vast, uncaring game of succession. Truly, it's enough to make you swear off all forms of hierarchy. All right, we've dragged ourselves through the cesspool of royal honeymoons, from medieval sheet inspections to the chilling loneliness of imperial harems. If you're not utterly disgusted by now, you've probably got the stomach for a career in historical voyeurism. What becomes starkly, brutally clear is this. Throughout history, regardless of continent, religion, or epoch, the royal wedding night was rarely about love, romance, or mutual discovery. It was almost universally a grim, calculated affair, a public duty performed in private, a brutal collision of individual human desire and the relentless, suffocating demands of power and lineage. There are no hero arcs here, just endless cycles of lust, power, and punishment dressed up in silk and suffering. The past, in its infinite wisdom, simply recycled its perversions. We started by ripping apart the fairy tale fantasy, and what we found underneath was a festering swamp of discomfort, indignity, and often outright horror. From the excruciating pressure to produce that telltale bloodstain under the leering eyes of an entire court, to the profound revulsion of being married to a genetically deformed stranger, to the terror of a mentally unstable spouse, and the physical degradation of utterly non-existent hygiene, the royal honeymoon was a masterclass in human suffering, masquerading as tradition. The sensory overload wasn't just visual, it was olfactory, tactile, and deeply, viscerally uncomfortable. Every throb, every moan, every suppressed gasp was not for pleasure, but for performance, for dynastic validation. It's enough to make you appreciate the glorious anonymity of modern dating, where at least your family isn't waiting outside the bedroom door with a magnifying glass. The pattern, depressingly, repeats itself across centuries and cultures. The woman's body, almost without exception, was seen as property, a vessel, a political tool. Her virginity was a commodity, her fertility a state asset, her pleasure an irrelevant luxury, if it was even considered at all. Her life, from the moment of her forced union, became a relentless cycle of reproductive demands, often under conditions of profound physical and emotional discomfort. The male, while holding power, was often equally trapped, pressured to perform, burdened by expectations of virility, and sometimes equally unsuited or unwilling to engage in the forced intimacy. The marital bed became a stage for a grotesque play where duty trumped desire and personal autonomy was sacrificed on the altar of succession. The silence of these private spaces was often filled not with whispers of affection, but with the suffocating weight of obligation and the quiet despair of unfulfilled lives. The role of religion, far from offering solace, often intensified the psychological burden, transforming a forced act into a sacred, yet equally agonizing, duty. The fear of sin, the need for divine approval, the constant confession of perceived failures, it all added layers of guilt and anxiety to an already fraught situation, and the vast imperial harems, with their hundreds or thousands of women, were not sensual paradises. They were gilded prisons, breeding grounds of cutthroat competition, soul-crushing loneliness, and a relentless struggle for a fleeting moment of an emperor's attention. The concept of intimacy was utterly obliterated, replaced by a cold, calculating system of managed reproduction. The very air in those luxurious palaces was thick with the stench of human desperation, far more pungent than any perfume. So, what does this parade of historical indignities teach us? Perhaps that human nature, in its pursuit of power and control, often finds the most creative and grotesque ways to subjugate the individual. That the veneer of civilization, of regal pomp and circumstance, often hides a swamp of profound personal misery. That the very foundations of these grand empires were built on the broken bodies and shattered psyches of individuals forced into unions they neither desired nor understood. The lust for power, the obsession with lineage, the ingrained misogyny, these were the driving forces behind the bizarre, painful, and often traumatic experiences of royal honeymoons. It makes you realize that our current dating woes, our first date jitters, our anxieties about modern relationships are practically a walk in the park compared to being paraded naked before a eunuch or having your hymen inspected by a committee of bishops. And don't think for a second that these dynamics have vanished entirely. The names and titles might have changed, but the fundamental patterns of power, control, and exploitation in intimate relationships persist. The pressure to conform, the societal expectations about marriage and progeny, the subtle, or not so subtle, commodification of bodies, it's all still lurking beneath the surface. We might not have public sheet inspections anymore, but social media provides its own unique, insidious form of surveillance, where every aspect of life is curated for public consumption, and personal failures are magnified for mass judgment. The throb of anxiety might be quieter, but it's still there, a constant hum in the background of our supposedly liberated lives. The beauty of history in its darkest corners is that it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It's easy to look back and scoff at the grossness, the ignorance, the barbarity of the past. But what if we're just better at masking it? What if our progress is simply a more sanitized, less physically repugnant version of the same old power games and sexual politics? The royal honeymoon, in all its agonizing detail, stands as a stark monument to humanity's enduring capacity for cruelty and its relentless obsession with control, even over the most intimate moments. It's a sobering thought that the same raw, biological urges, the same thirst for power, the same human vulnerabilities continue to play out, just with better plumbing and less public nudity. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps haunted by the faint, lingering odor of unwashed historical royalty, remember the truth. The past was rarely polite, rarely romantic, and almost never private. And when it came to the most intimate act of all, it was often a brutal, dehumanizing performance, a testament to the enduring, grotesque perversions of power. The world has always been a messy place, full of lust, shame, and the desperate crawl for survival. And sometimes the most profound insights come from wallowing in the historical filth, discovering that human misery often wears a crown. Sweet dreams, perverts. May your own honeymoons be blessedly private and mercifully odor-free.